Hi everyone, and welcome to the third webinar in a series following the launch of the Self-Assessment Scorecard and Guidance. My name is Dami, and I'll be your host for today. Before we get started, it would be great if we can know who is in the room. Please feel free to put your name, your role, your location in the chat now. I'll give you a moment to do that. She Foundation worked with Mekong Club and Stop the Traffic to create a resource which comprises of both a scorecard, an online questionnaire, and a supporting guide that allows local authorities and other public sector bodies to assess their modern slavery risk. So this webinar focuses on the fourth theme within the guide, which is on risk assessments and risk mapping. And we have some lovely guests who will be giving a guest talk a little bit later on. But before we get started, I would like to provide a very brief overview of what this 1 hour will look like. I'll provide a brief overview of the scorecard and guide, and then I will introduce theme 4 of the guide and what we talk about in that section. And then I'll hand over to our guest speakers to talk a bit more about their expertise in risk mapping and how their input in this project has made it even better than what we could hope for. And then we will have a bit of a Q&A, so we'll have some time at the end. If you have any questions throughout the presentation on what any of the speakers are talking about, please do add your questions in the Q&A function. So not in the chat, in the Q&A function. And at the end, I'll read them out and our guests will answer them. Hopefully that's clear to everyone. So really briefly, for those who haven't heard about the scorecard and guide, I'll do a very brief overview to the resource. So it's made up of 2 elements: an online scorecard, which is basically an online questionnaire, has about 12 main questions and a few sub-questions. And then there's the supporting guide, which supports organizations to be able to answer the questionnaire. Questionnaires are of a total of about 400 points. And depending on how many points you score, you're given a specific classification, which I'll talk about a little bit later. To get the most out of the resource, we really encourage organizations to use them both at the same time, because, to be able to get the most out of the scorecard, the guidance provides you with some tips on how to do that and how to answer it as accurately as possible. As I mentioned, once you've completed the scorecard, you'll be given a set amount of points. So if you score between 0 and 175 points, your organization is classified as developing in terms of your response to modern slavery, 176 to 300 advancing, 301 up to 400 points leading across the 8 themes that we speak about. It's important to mention that even though you're given an overall score, you could score in any of these 1 brackets across each of the themes. So it's really important to pay close attention to the guidance. There's no maximum amount of times that you can take the scorecard. It really is there for you to self-assess your own risk of modern slavery. There's no kind of scoreboard where we publicize any of the points. That doesn't happen. It's really for you to understand where you're at across all of the 8 themes that we speak about. Now over to the guidance. As I mentioned, should be read alongside the scorecard. There are 3 main sections, which I'll introduce later, 8 key themes, one of which is risk assessments. And like I mentioned, you'll be given a final score and fall into one of those 3 brackets. So the 3 sections of the guide, just to briefly introduce them, the first section looks at the context of the project, why we decided to create it, how to use the scorecard. It provides some of that practical guidance and context around this resource. The second section looks at the 8 key themes, and it provides tiered guidance of how to work towards best practice in each of those 8 themes. And then the annexes has a bunch of useful resources. It has a list of questions, provides the actual local authority profiles that SCT is going to be talking about, provides an anonymized version of those, and a few other bits and pieces, which again provided a wider context of the project. The 8 themes that we speak about in this guide are listed here, and the webinars that we're holding over the next 2 weeks run across all of these 8 themes. Today's one focuses on risk assessments and risk mapping, which really is the bulk of the project that ICT took on, and I'm really excited to hear from them a little bit later as well. Before I hand over, I just want to give a brief overview into this section and how to read this aspect of the guide. So If you go to theme 4, risk assessments, there's an introduction to risk assessments, which covers about 2.5 pages. Brief overview into what this section covers, essentially what should be included in your risk assessment, how frequently you should do it, why it's important to understand who are your high risk versus mid risk and low risk suppliers, and including them in your risk assessments as well. Those 2 pages are followed by 3 tables, a developing table, advancing, and leading table. Essentially, the developing table talks about being at the very beginning of your risk assessment journey. Advancing, maybe you've been on the journey for a while. What are the elements that your risk assessment should look like? And if you're working towards best practice, the leading table talks about the different elements that we think you should at least be touching on. And just to briefly outline those, mainly it talks about having a standalone modern slavery risk assessment, categorizing your suppliers, creating risk assessments and making sure that you're updating them frequently, and also effectively managing the data of your suppliers, which also be found throughout the risk assessment exercise. That is really important for local authorities to do as well. And at this point, I would love to hand over to SCT, who was a major partner on this project. And so we have Ewan and Fina. Fina is the Prevention Programme Manager at Stop the Traffic. She is leading the Pan-London project, which aims to transform how London local authorities are responding to human trafficking through data sharing and collaboration. Fina has many years' experience working with vulnerable community groups, previously working as an independent gender violence advocate, supporting high-risk survivors of gender-based violence and coordinating multi-agency responses. And Ewan is the business and human rights analyst at SCT. Ewan is driven to promote the protection of human rights in supply chains. In addition to supporting human rights consultancy for large international companies, he has been involved in creating the local authority self-assessment scorecard with Sheen Foundation, the Mekong Club, and funded by the Home Office. So I'll hand over to Fina and Ewan now. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Dami, for the introduction, and thank you everyone so much for attending the webinar today. As Dami has said, we're going to be talking about local authority risk mapping today, and particularly how local authorities can mitigate inherent modern slavery and human trafficking risks in their supply chain. Dami's done a great job of introducing ourselves, so I won't go too much into that, but just to quickly expand on that. So I work on the Pan-London project, which means I work very closely with local authorities in London, as well as other partners in the modern slavery and human trafficking sector in London. And I've been at Stop the Traffic for just over a year now. Ewan, would you like to expand on your introduction?
Sure. No, thank you very much for having us, and thank you all for coming today. Once again, my name is Ewan. I work as a business and human rights analyst for the consulting team at Stop the Traffic. A lot of my work involves conducting policy reviews, conducting supply chain risk mappings, especially for food and beverage businesses and international hospitality businesses. However, now with this foray into working for the supply chain risk mapping for local authorities, that's something that we're expanding into as well. So very excited to be on call with you all today and to share everything that we have to share.
Thanks, Ewan. So to go through a quick agenda for today's webinar, we're going to be starting off by introducing Stop the Traffic to you all. Some of you may know who Stop the Traffic are, some of you may not. So we're just going to do a quick introduction of who we are. And then I'm going to do a very brief introduction to modern slavery and human trafficking. Again, many of you may be very familiar with modern slavery and human trafficking, but some of you may not be. So just to kind of go over some definitions of that. We are then going to be moving on to the importance of risk mapping, and particularly why it's so important for local authorities and public sector bodies to risk map. Then we're going to be talking about the findings of the supply chain risk mapping, which Stop the Traffic carried out as part of the local authorities self-assessment scorecard project. And finally, we're going to conclude with some targeted and long-term recommendations on actions that local authorities such as yourselves can take to mitigate modern slavery and exploitation in your supply chains. So, great. So starting off by introducing Stop the Traffic. So we are an NGO. We have been in existence for 17 years. We focus on prevention. We do intersect with support and rehabilitation work, particularly through our prevention campaigns. However, our main focus is on how we can stop trafficking through disrupting recruitment, reducing demand, and hampering the movement of the finances of trafficking. We have multiple different teams at Stop the Traffic. To quickly go over a few of them, our prevention team specialises in prevention campaigns, and we have run these campaigns globally, reaching 20 million people at risk of modern slavery and human trafficking, with 80% of those reached saying that they will take preventative action. We also have a business consultancy team, and this team works to advise organisations, so both private sector organisations and public sector organisations, on how to mitigate the potential human rights abuses and modern slavery issues. And they do this by through multiple different ways, to name a few: risk mapping supply chains, which obviously we're going to be talking about today, but also advising on governance, providing awareness training, developing long-term strategies. And we have risk mapped £17 billion worth of procurement spend globally so far. Finally, to note that none of our work at Stop the Traffic can be done without data. We are a data and intelligence-led organisation, and the main hub of all of this data is the Traffic Analysis Hub, which is currently the largest global data set on modern slavery and human trafficking. And the idea behind the Traffic Analysis Hub is that we can only begin to change the demand of modern slavery and human trafficking once we fully understand it. Next slide, please. So just to quickly go over the definitions of modern slavery and human trafficking. So starting with modern slavery, for criminals, modern slavery and human trafficking is a very low risk and high profit crime. Modern slavery is an umbrella term and human trafficking falls under it. So all forms of modern slavery have to encompass two elements for it to be defined as such. As you can see, we have the means, which is in the bright orange part on the circle on the left of our Venn diagram. And the means is the methods in which a person is coerced, forced, or deceived. We then have the purpose, which is on the right-hand side of the Venn diagram. And the purpose asks, why is a person being exploited? And the answer is almost always for financial gain. We're then going to move on to the next slide, where we're defining human trafficking. So as you can see from the Venn diagram, human trafficking adds a third element into the mix, which is the act. So here we have the means, the purpose, and the act. And the act is the movement of a person for the purpose of exploitation. So two things really quickly to note about the act. Firstly, this movement of people does not need to cross borders. And secondly, this act or movement can include the recruitment of people. And finally, when we're defining human trafficking, in the case of child trafficking, only two elements need to be present, so the act and the purpose, but the means doesn't need to be present when we're talking about child trafficking. And this really is to reflect the understanding that children cannot consent to their exploitation. And next slide, please. Thank you. So exploitation can happen for a variety of different reasons and may manifest itself in different forms, such as sexual exploitation, labour exploitation, domestic servitude, and organ harvesting, to name a few. High-risk sectors which are likely to come up in a local authority supply chain are construction, cleaning, hospitality, and security services. And this is because they all heavily rely on subcontracting and recruitment agencies to keep costs low. This really limits regulation in the sector as it creates a multi-layered supply chain of temporary workers. And with the tight margins and demands, working hours can very easily become excessive and wages can become little to none. In addition, these sectors can often be quite isolated. So if we think about construction and cleaning, they can be quite isolated sectors. This just further facilitates the conditions for exploitative practices. And to give a quick example of labour exploitation, which is common in construction, that is the practice of workers being forced to pay recruitment fees. And this can really easily lead to exploitation, as workers can find themselves in debt bondage, paying off the never-ending debt of their recruitment fees. And so these are just the kind of risks that local authorities need to be aware of, and we will come back to these risk factors and high-risk sectors towards the end of today's webinar. And I'm going to hand over to you, Ewan, for the next slide.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vina, for painting that context. So moving into this section, now that we've highlighted the particular risks that could face local authorities through their procurement with labour exploitation, I'll be going into a section talking about the legislation and human rights commitments that local authorities have. So it's important to note that when it comes to modern slavery and human trafficking, or MSHT, when occurrences of MSHT take place, oftentimes many human rights are violated at once, such as rights to work, rights to just and favorable working conditions, rights, freedom from degrading treatment. And if you move more towards the raw materials level of supply chains, the rights of communities as well as indigenous peoples can also be violated. And because of this salient risk, local authorities can play a crucial role in ensuring the safety of the communities that they serve from modern slavery and human trafficking, especially under Section 52 of the Modern Slavery Act 2015. However, when it comes to supply chains, local authority procurement staff have a unique ability to also protect communities around the world and around the UK along their supply chains from modern slavery. And in terms of legislative context, while at the moment the Modern Slavery Act Section 54, Transparency in Supply Chains, does not mandate local authorities to publish transparency statements, coming changes to the legislation will soon mandate this for local authorities and public bodies that have a budget of £36 million and above. And additionally, many councils at the moment are publishing these transparency and modern slavery statements voluntarily. So this is the legislative context in which the commitments to human rights that local authorities have sit. Can we go to the next slide, please? So in addition to modern slavery and human trafficking's links with many human rights abuses, MSHT does also link with other crimes when it is committed. One example is tax evasion. This is a non-exhaustive list, by the way. So one example is tax evasion. Oftentimes, MSHT operates in the informal economy, and what this could mean is that councils could be losing out on tax revenue, which could be invested to the betterment of their local communities that they serve. Another crime that MSHT often connects with is money laundering. So the proceeds of trafficking often are funneled through legitimate financial systems and banks. And this often the proceeds are moved to fund other related illicit activities and crimes. The next one on the list is drugs trafficking. So money gained from labor exploitation, perhaps cannabis cultivation, could be used to fund further drug trafficking. And within the UK, this often uses children as a means of transport for these drugs through county lines. And finally, in some of the worst cases, nuclear proliferation financing could take place in linkage to MSHT. And a particularly unique case study during the pandemic period was that the UK's government personal protective equipment, PPE, supply chains had been discovered to utilize Chinese factories that had used North Korean forced labor, of which these workers would have 70% of their wages deducted by the North Korean government. And this was likely going off to be funding the North Korean nuclear program. So looking at the bottom of the slide here, procurement staff in local authorities have a crucial role to play in protecting communities from MSHT through ensuring that supply chains are not only resilient, but that they're also free from exploitation. We could jump to the next slide, please. So I know that we've covered a lot of negative impacts of MSHT and the consequences of failing to prevent it as local authority staff, but I'm not highlighting these examples as ways to frighten you into caring for modern slavery. But I'm using these examples to tell you that these are the kinds of crimes and human rights abuses that we're working hard to protect people from through the work that both you and I do. And one example I want to bring up is the Universal Call to Protect Human Rights. And the story that's on this screen took place before even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted by the UN. So even without the relevant frameworks and legislation for human rights protections, the universal call still does apply. So this example starts with, before the communist takeover of China, Ho Fengshan, pictured on the right, was the consul general for the Republic of China in Vienna between 1938 and 1940. And he's actually known as the Chinese Schindler. And this is because as the persecution of the Jews was increasing, he worked tirelessly to issue thousands of visas to Jews to flee to Shanghai and to save them from concentration camps like Dachau. So while he wasn't a soldier or a national leader, he did whatever he could in his personal capacity and context to protect innocent lives. So the moral of the story is that no matter our position, capacity, context, or our place, we all have the power and duty to protect human rights in whatever way we can. And once again, driving the point home, procurement staff, namely people who are attending this call, have a uniquely placed ability to protect human rights within the communities that they serve in the UK, as well as communities internationally and domestically along different supply chains. If we could jump to the next slide, please. So with that context in mind of the risks facing local authorities because of modern slavery and human trafficking, and the universal call to protect human rights on the other hand, I'd now like to go into explaining the importance of risk mapping, especially supply chain risk mapping for local authorities. One thing to note is that risk mapping is a tool that's used to identify MSHT risks that lie along certain parts of your supply chain. And it needs to be noted that this has to be an ongoing process. It's not possible to be effective if you do a risk mapping once and not do it again. An analogy for this would be if I wanted to navigate from one point in London to another, it wouldn't make sense for me to use a map from the 1920s to navigate in 2023, because the landscape changes, the geography changes, the roads change, different places have different blockages. Likewise, the MSHT landscape changes year on year, month on month. This needs to be an ongoing and regular process to ensure that we're tackling up-to-date issues. So risk mapping, it should look at the countries of risk, and this looks at risk drivers such as the quality of the rule of law in that country, the population of vulnerable demographics. I want to note that vulnerable demographics population in and of themselves are not a problem, but if inadequate protections are placed around them, then they are especially at more risk of exploitation. I wanted to add that nuance, especially in this context. And we also look at risk drivers such as civil rights. Moving on to more granularity, so sectors of risk. Risk mapping looks at the different sectors and detailed areas where risk could come from. And these risk drivers within sectors can come from prevalence of subcontracting, which usually blurs supply chain responsibility, especially for worker well-being, because as you're outsourcing the work to a subcontractor, you are also outsourcing the care for worker well-being and worker protections to that subcontractor as well. Other risk drivers we also look at are level of skill required to enter employment into a certain sector. It's a bit of a misnomer because skill is, based on my research, is much more to do with barriers of entry into employment, as well as the turnover rate. One example of this is I used to work in the care sector, and the care sector does require a very high degree of empathy, emotional and interpersonal skills, but it's still, and not everyone can do it not everyone can do it well. However, it still has a very high turnover and high replaceability of workers, and also has a lot of national minimum wage violations. So just to paint that context, and looking at the bottom of the slide, maps are only useful if you allow them to guide your decision-making. There's no point in me looking at Google Maps on how to go to my favorite pub if I don't follow the map's instructions. So risk mapping is a critical first step that informs effective decision-making, and you have to make those decisions based on what the mapping is. If we could jump to the next slide, please. So with this context in mind, we're going to go into our inherent risk mapping methodology. So on the right-hand side, you can see that we rank country risk as well as sector risk based on a 1 to 5 scale, and the risk escalates based on what the graph shows. And wherever possible, we do our best to implement a live data feed element through the traffic analysis hub. So, a lot of our work comes from desk-based research, comes from news reports. However, we want to use the live data that we have coming through our partner organizations that have subscribed and contributed to the Traffic Analysis Hub. And this gives a much richer picture of what exploitation looks like on the ground and how we can address it. You can only combat and confront something if you know exactly what it is you're confronting. So that's the philosophy and ethos from which we come from. Over to my colleague Fina for explaining the local authorities self-assessment scorecard.
Thank you, Ewan. And yeah, on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So obviously, Dami introduced the local authority self-assessment scorecard at the beginning of the webinar, so I won't go into too much detail. However, as some of you might know, in November of last year, we launched the Local Authority Self-Assessment Scorecard, and it was produced by Shiva Foundation, Stop the Traffic, and the Mekong Club, and it was funded by the Home Office. The resource we really hope will empower local authorities such as yourselves to self-assess your modern slavery risk across a number of key thematic areas, and it will provide you with advice on how you can improve. As Dami also mentioned, as well as the scorecard, we produced an accompanying guide which provides tiered signposting to further resources, templates and frameworks, allowing those who are using it to really embed best practice across all areas of their work. The project was launched in light of the government's package of measures to strengthen the Modern Slavery Act. And this included, amongst other things, extending the reporting requirement to public bodies with a budget of £36 million or more. And as the UK public sector amounts to approximately £250 billion in annual spend, this change in legislation could present a really powerful opportunity to directly impact modern slavery risk in this sector. Although the extension of the Modern Slavery Act is on hold due to there not being a Modern Slavery Commissioner in post, this change is likely to come about soon, and we are seeing other EU countries bringing in similar changes. And yeah, I think councils are really uniquely placed with the wide range of goods and services that you procure, which places you at the forefront of the fight against modern slavery. So as part of the local authority self-assessment scorecard, Stop the Traffic used its methodology, which Ewan has just introduced, to conduct a supply chain inherent risk mapping on 2 local authorities' supply chains. So one was a London-based local authority and the other one was a county council. And we did that risk mapping back in last year in 2022. And I'm going to hand back over to Ewan to speak a little bit about our findings. And next slide, please.
Thank you very much, Fina. So we conducted a risk mapping for a council in London as well as a council in the countryside in the UK. Note on the page when it says a London Borough Council, it's a borough in London, not Borough Council. So based on the risk mapping, we found that both councils' procurement spend was mostly consolidated within risk levels 4 and 5, moderate, high, and high risk respectively, and that all of these councils' suppliers were located in the UK. So this poses quite interesting and advantageous opportunities. I'll address point number 2 first about all the suppliers being in the UK. So the reason why this is advantageous is that supplier engagement for risk mitigation purposes will be made much, much easier because all the suppliers are in the UK. This mitigates and lowers the difficulty levels that could be to do with cultural barriers, linguistic barriers, geographical barriers as well. And, say if your suppliers were in China, you might have to deal with COVID-related pandemic restrictions. And in this case, with all suppliers being in the UK, that's not going to be as much of a problem. And addressing the first point of consolidation, one way to look at how effective and how high impact risk mitigation efforts can be is to look at it by average spend per supplier in different risk levels. So as you can see on the graphs, within levels 4 and 5, the average spend per supplier was higher than in 2 and 3. And I just want to caveat and add nuance by saying that it's not, one can't always look at risk mitigation efforts from a perspective of average spend per supplier. And this can be because within certain risk levels, perhaps maybe 2 to 5 suppliers can hold a disproportionate amount of the procurement spend within that risk level and thus skew the result. And therefore, average spend per supplier isn't quite an accurate representation of what the situation is. But in the context of this risk mapping between the borough council and the county council, looking at it from the perspective of average spend per supplier did make sense within that context. So with more consolidation, which is more average, with a higher average spend per supplier in a risk level, this means that you can conduct due diligence that addresses more spend, but across less suppliers, which makes it more impactful with comparatively less effort. If we could jump into the next slide, please. So going into further granularity into the sectors that were highlighted, first we'll go into the construction sector. So we identified it to be high risk due to reasons such as heavy use of migrant workers, high prevalence of illegal working practices, heavy reliance on recruitment agencies and subcontracting, and prevalent use of retention payments, which can affect worker pay. So migrant workers, once again, migrant workers in and of themselves are not a risk, but if adequate protections are not present, then they are even more at risk of exploitation. The high prevalence of illegal working practices, these usually include lacks of proper working contract, poor health and safety, low pay as well as perhaps lacks of training, heavy reliance on recruitment agencies and subcontracting. As referenced before, subcontracting and temporary agencies tends to not only outsource the work, but then also outsources the worker protections to that subcontractor. So it's crucial to have oversight of how subcontractors and temp agencies are conducting due diligence to protect their own workers, because that risk will feed into your own supply chains and into your own operations as well, if unmitigated. And prevalent use of retentions of payment. This is quite prevalent within the construction sector, and it often means that cutting costs and cutting corners means pricing out ethical actors, which does increase risk in the sector overall. So looking at some case studies moving forward, historically based on the 2019 estimates from the Gang Masters and Labor Abuse Authority, Albanians are known to be the most commonly exploited demographic within the construction sector. Romanians are also quite commonly exploited. However, moving forward with the influx of migrants coming from Albania coming over into the UK, this demographic will likely be even more at risk moving forward, and it's something that local authorities need to be paying attention to and to be aware of and to mitigate against. And on top of that, construction companies present a unique supply chain leverage opportunity. Because construction projects tend to be quite expensive and cost millions of pounds. This inherently means that local councils have an increased ability to use that leverage of large supply chain spend to encourage construction suppliers to improve their practice and to increase risk mitigation efforts. If we could jump to the next slide, please. Thank you. The next sector that we highlighted was facilities management. And likewise, many of the similar risks to construction were highlighted, such as vulnerable demographic workers, including migrants, illegal working practices, lots of subcontracting. This one's quite unique. This one has a bit of a unique twist because a lot of facilities management contracting is given over to providers who can provide it at the lowest cost. And if it's at the lowest cost, then it's normally at the risk of risking minimum wage violations towards workers in that sector. And it also has a high prevalence of recruitment fees, which are exploitative, especially among migrant workers. So looking at case studies, prior to the COVID pandemic, facilities management and soft FM workers were already struggling to make ends meet. And COVID actually exacerbated this because a lot of places that they would have been cleaning for work had to close down, which limited their ability to work. In addition, there was also quite very poor provision of PPE and health and safety equipment during the pandemic, which placed facilities management workers at heightened risk of being infected with COVID. And Furthermore, one interesting finding was that the county council was found to have 2 major facilities management suppliers that held most of the spend. So this means that there's a unique opportunity to utilize increased leverage for supplier engagement in this case. I'm going to pass it over to Fina for looking at the next sector that's highlighted.
Thank you. Yeah, and if we can move on to the next slide, please. So the care sector is the final highlighted high-risk sector that we're going to speak about. Again, the risk factors that are listed down the left-hand side of the page are fairly similar to the previous highlighted sectors, such as wage deductions, widespread lack of pay for overtime or travel. And so the similarities between the 3 sectors here means that due diligence targeting specific demographics and labour violation risks might be possible. Updating of procurement contracts to increase risk mitigation quality in subcontractors and temporary agencies could manage risk across all 3 of the sectors that we've mentioned. Another key risk driver in this sector is that the care sector is mainly made up of small businesses that don't meet the £36 million threshold of the Modern Slavery Act requirements for supply chain transparency and due diligence. This means that much of the care sector procurement that local authorities are doing could be at risk of not being accountable to the Modern Slavery Act, which means they're not conducting due diligence or risk mapping their own supply chains. And something else that we found through our risk mapping exercise of the 2 councils was that with the county council, their procurement spend in the care sector had a very low degree of consolidation, with the average spend per care sector supplier being roughly £400,000. So what we saw with construction and facilities management was that there was a large amount of spend falling under a smaller number of suppliers, but with the care sector, where we had a lack of consolidation, due diligence efforts may be more difficult as there are more suppliers to address here. So that's just something to note. And finally, to give a recent example of exploitation in the care sector, earlier this year, 9 Indian care workers were rescued in North Wales. The workers were students who were found living in cramped and unsanitary conditions. The company responsible for the exploitation was reported to the Modern Slavery and Exploitation Helpline for incorrectly paying the workers and withholding wages. And also concerns were raised about the workers' appearances, and the GLAA said that they were reported to always appear hungry. And just on that, last year, UK universities raised concerns about increasing numbers of international students dropping out of courses to work in care homes. And care homes are a sector facing severe staff shortages. And as we have kind of discussed earlier on in the webinar, where labour shortages exist, as they do in the care sector, there is an increased risk of exploiters using this situation for their own financial gain. And can we please move on to the next slide, please?
Thank you very much for that. So moving on to recommendations as well as strategic actions, local authorities should begin to work with high-risk suppliers to mitigate the most pressing modern slavery risks to their supply chain through these different steps. And note, these are not in any particular order. So once again, we mentioned a lot that a lot of the risks across the highlighted sectors were fairly similar, such as exploitation of vulnerable demographics, national minimum wage violations, cutting costs and cutting corners. The first recommendation that we have is improving due diligence processes related with that. So updating procurement contracts, as well as self-assessment questionnaires, and as well as audits to account for these common risks across sectors can really help to address multiple high-risk sectors at once. So that's one approach for it. The establishing of clear reporting and remediation pathways is absolutely crucial. And these pathways need to be designed to address unique risks that your local authorities may face. And it's also important to ensure that the relevant staff, for the staff that are relevant to those reporting pathways, are made very clear and made aware that they exist and how to access them. This is very crucial for an effective pathway. Move on to other recommendations, offering training and engagement. Training helps to build capacity of suppliers that you're working with. And in addition, building good relationships with your suppliers, getting to know them, getting to know their particular risks and challenges really helps to build that relationship and bring them along onto your side for wanting to improve risk mitigation practice. And finally, the last main recommendation, consolidating spend. So you can increase leverage over suppliers by trying to move away from many small suppliers with lesser spend to moving to fewer suppliers with more spend. So thus increasing the average spend per supplier and increasing your ability to utilize supply chain spend leverage to encourage them for better practice. And once again, these are very broad recommendations. Your council faces unique challenges and unique risks and has unique systems that you have to work with. So Stop the Traffic does have an ethos of going on this journey with its clients to combat MSHT. So with your unique challenges and unique context, if you need any support at all in any of these areas on the screen or other areas, please don't hesitate to ask us.
Thanks, Ewan. And on to the final slide, please. So yeah, thank you. That's the end of our webinar today. Obviously, we're going to be moving on to questions. Thank you so much for listening to us. Before we move on to questions, there are some email addresses on the board. So we've got my email address, Ewan's, and our general Stop the Traffic email addresses. We've also got a lovely QR code there, which will take you straight through to sending us an email. As Ewan said, if there's any help that you need, or you just want to have a chat to us about what you're doing and how we can support, please don't hesitate to reach out and send us over an email. So yeah, Dami, over to you with the questions.
Thank you so much. That was a really informative presentation. It's always good to hear the methodology behind the approach for risk mapping. We've got quite a few questions. A few of them cover a few of the same areas, so I'm going to try and merge them together, but we'll see how far we get. The first question is, from your work doing risk mapping for councils, what sectors are the highest risk for us? So that's someone else asked, why did you pick facilities management, construction and care to highlight? What other areas are those areas that we should start with?
Sorry, could you repeat the question, please? I felt like I understood it, but just
yeah, sure. So the first question is, from your work doing risk mapping for councils, what sectors are the highest risk for us? And then someone else asked, why did you pick those 3 sectors to highlight? So where should they start and which are the highest risk sectors?
That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, the highest risk sectors based on our analysis is still construction, facilities management, and care. Construction was chosen because because of the salient risks. It's generally quite a high risk sector within the UK for the reasons we specified. But then we also chose it because of the unique ability for councils to apply supply chain spend leverage, because there's usually millions of pounds of spend on hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds of spend on individual construction suppliers, which means you have more leverage. So yeah. When we choose particular sectors to target, yes, while there are other high risk sectors that are there, we're aiming to choose sectors where there's an ability for risk mitigation to be less effort, but more impact. It's kind of like a bang for buck approach, because local councils, private sector companies have limited ability and resource to conduct risk mitigation. So we're really trying to choose the areas that have the most impact with proportionally less effort. So that's where we're coming from. Care sector was particularly interesting. It had a slightly lower risk level, but upon doing our research, we identified that it did have quite unique and salient risks because of the COVID pandemic, and especially because over time, the care sector has moved from being local council provided and funded to becoming now more decentralized and more private sector driven, with many smaller providers, which puts it at more risk of being more difficult to oversee the due diligence for that, oversee workers' protections, as well as what Fina was saying, that many of them will not fall under the provisions of Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act, and thus they may not have the due diligence systems put in place to protect workers. So it's one key area to look at which is a sector that has a lot of spend for local authorities. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it did. And actually, we've got a lot more spend questions coming through. So I'm going to quickly reel those off. So you mentioned spend and it's how it's important to have, that leverage with your suppliers. Someone asked, doesn't consolidating spend go against economic growth and working with SMEs?
We've encountered this issue before. So to an extent, it can. That's why at the end of the presentation, I said that local authorities face quite a unique context and unique priorities. And the thing that I've learned over time is that due diligence, there's not often a right or a wrong approach. You just have to take the approach that matches with your priorities and the values of your organization. So just because if you want to work with SMEs and you're not able to consolidate, 10 million pounds of spend into one small supplier, there's other ways to conduct due diligence and to improve practice across the board, even while trying to support SMEs. So I just wanted to say that and just add that nuance.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a similar question on spend, but hopefully that answers your question in the chat. So you mentioned about kind of moving away from like smaller or medium-sized suppliers, possibly consolidating spend. So we've got another question. Is a challenge for large councils to reduce their reliance on small and medium suppliers, as there are so many of these in the care sector, like you mentioned? Do you have thoughts about how to prioritize your suppliers in adult social care to make the risk assessment process practical?
Sorry, could you repeat the question, please, just so I can understand it a bit more, please? Thank you. Sorry.
No worries at all. So it's a challenge for large councils to reduce their reliance on small and medium suppliers because there's so many of these in the care sector. Do you have any thoughts about how to prioritize your suppliers in adult social care to make the risk assessment process more practical?
I suppose one aspect, one of the recommendations was to update self-assessment questionnaires. And one way to utilize this would be during the onboarding process. So even before a supplier is brought on to being procured from for a local authority, taking a proactive and preemptive approach could be really good for addressing this. So a self-assessment questionnaire can be used to assess and diagnose how a potential supplier could be doing with their own due diligence and their own worker protection processes. So that's one area that could be addressed to work on this. So updating supplier assessment questionnaires to account for unique risks such as vulnerable demographics. How do you account for, I mean, for the care sector, it's a bit more specific because some of the risks are to do with, not paying people for their travel time or for being on call. So doing a thorough analysis of what are the root causes for exploitation in a sector, and then taking account for those in due diligence processes like self-assessment questionnaires will really help to address that. Because if you're giving a self-assessment questionnaire to every potential supplier, then you're getting like a blanket diagnosis of how the sector's doing and how potential suppliers approaching you are doing as well. I hope that answers the question. If you ever want to email us with further information, our contact details are available.
Great. Okay, so comment from Caroline from Nottingham Rights Lab. One way of prioritizing risk within adult social care suppliers is to ask for and examine their labour turnover rates, as Ewan said. That this can be an indicator of vulnerability if suitable protections are not in place. Thank you for that addition, Caroline. We appreciate it. Talking more about care sector, for your risk mapping, did the care sector include children's services or just specifically adult social care services?
Great question. The care sector generally included, I have to go into my memory here. It was residential care for the elderly, residential care for the I think it was mentally ill and handicapped was the official classification based on the ONS. And then I think it's also for children and teenagers. It's just the care sector in general. It's not specifically for adults or a specific demographic. It's just in general.
Great. Another question here, slightly different tangent. Can you talk about contracts that include high levels of ICT or tech and the human rights elements for global supply chains? do you have any guidance on expectations we should have for our suppliers where ICT might be the highest modern slavery risk?
ICT, I'm assuming that they probably mean kind of like computer parts and those kinds of things. I don't have an answer off the top of my head. However, if you want to email that question through, I'd be very happy to answer that. But yeah, very, very unique question. We didn't highlight ICT in terms of in the risk mapping. It wasn't one of the major sectors that came up, unfortunately, but happy to answer that question over email if you'd like that.
Cool, thank you. Another question here, what types of modern slavery and exploitation were identified most in tier 1 supply chains in your risk mapping for the councils?
Great question. The main risks were highlighted on the slides in the highlighted sector. So, things like recruitment fees are quite common because especially for migrant workers, sometimes migrant workers, if they really want to work in a certain country, will view a recruitment fee as something that guarantees them the work. However, recruitment fees are illegal and they may not know that. So that's one area. Cutting costs, especially with retentions. Retentions usually means that construction contractors don't get paid fully, and then that impacts their finances, which then affects their ability to pay workers properly. So that's another area that we've seen. I think it really, I could go on and on, but it really does depend on the sector. I think referencing the slides again first for those unique risks is a good starting point.
Yeah. And just to add to what Ewan has said, there is a section in the supporting guidance of the scorecard where we speak about the risk mapping and what we found in more detail, which does include kind of what type of exploitation we were seeing. So I would go ahead and download it and take a look at the supporting guidance because there is more information in there. Yeah.
Thanks, Ina.
It's okay.
Last question from me. Just lost it. So I think it's what team comes across like the most risk. I believe if I read that correctly. What team in a council do you believe comes across the most risk?
What team in a council comes across the most risks?
So what teams in local councils do you think come across the highest risk? It's quite tricky to answer that without understanding of a specific council's processes and teams. I think a lot like different organizations have different structures. So unfortunately, without proper analysis of your context and your organization, I'm not able to answer that question, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would say the way we did our risk mapping, we didn't look into different teams in the council. We just looked at suppliers line by line. So we did it kind of supplier based rather than team based. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it would be quite difficult to answer that on the spot, I would say.
Great. And then I've got a personal question. So working on you with this project, we did find that there are a few data management tips that you had for local councils as they're actually managing their database of suppliers. I was wondering if you can just touch on a little bit of those tips for managing the data of their suppliers in their system that can make it easier or make this process of risk mapping your supply chain easier over time. Sure.
Broadly speaking, consolidating spend of the same suppliers is a great first step. What we often find when we're given procurement data from different organizations is that sometimes suppliers will be repeated, but with different levels of spend. But we actually, based on the details that we're given, we find out that it's actually the same supplier. So really keeping track of keeping on top of those, keeping it clean, really helps to track how much spend a supplier is actually receiving. And then additionally, using unique codes to identify certain suppliers can be one way to make it more searchable and more easy to navigate. Those are some quite broad recommendations. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, perfectly. I don't think we have any more questions that I can see. Hopefully I haven't missed any, but we will email you any information or any other questions that come through. Thank you so much, Fiona and Ewan, for your time and for your work on this project, and for all the attendees that have attended this webinar. The next one is this Thursday, where we do a bit of a deep dive into procurement contracts, engaging with your suppliers, what's the process of auditing that your council might have. So a nice follow-on from this session. So hopefully see you all on Thursday. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Danny,
you.
and thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you. See you later. Bye.